Hello and welcome to Skyview Concert Hall. I'm Ashley Johnson.
I'm Greg Scholl, trombonist in the Vancouver Symphony, and welcome to Da Capo.
I am very excited for the big piece, shall we say, on this weekend's program. It's Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and this is one that the VSO has not done in a good long while.
That's right. I think we played this piece about 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I wasn't around for that one. So Hector Berlioz, not a lot is known about his early years.
That's right. We know that he was born in France in 1803, and one thing we do know is that he was the opposite of a child prodigy such as Mozart, the other composer on the concert this weekend. He did not grow up as a musical prodigy, and he was not a particularly gifted child. In fact, he never in his entire life learned how to play any useful instrument correctly. This is really important because other composers of music learned a sort of handling with finesse the materials of music. They sort of had that skill because it was developed in them as children, and they could sort of do that automatically when they started working. Some composers learned the materials of music and remained technicians or players or pure composers, but they had that innate sense of sort of an established professionalism in their writing, and that's something that Berlioz lacked.
Which clearly offered some interesting texture to his music. So did he write at all as a young person?
Well, his father was a physician, and he saw to it that Berlioz was well educated, but when it came to music, there really was nobody around to help. His impulses are present in his earliest writings. There are notebooks full of rudimentary compositions that he sort of worked out on his own. He taught himself everything that he could about composing without much parental support. In fact, his father wanted him to be a doctor.
So his lack of training impacted his work?
Yes, to be honest, he never really had the ease with forms and materials that other composers got to take for granted. And because of that, his forms are different and self-evolved in his own sort of perspective and his own style. Some of his ideas turned out very brilliantly, and others just didn't come off all that well. It is said that some of his works lack a point to the writing or sound like he is continually struggling to shape things within the piece. It's safe to say he lacked some of the established ABCs of his craft.
Clearly, though, he had something going for him.
Well, he did, and that was his geniusness. What he lacked in skill and craft, he made up for with this superheated imagination that he had. And in fact, his imagination helped him turn his lack of training to his advantage. He did things that nobody else could or would think of. Not just like a composer coming up with a new melody that is pretty and exciting. This is broader than that. This is somebody sort of developing a whole new way of writing music for an orchestra.
Fascinating. So he must have been aware of this shortcoming that he had.
Absolutely, and I think his mindset was, although he could not play an individual instrument competently, he focused on playing 100 instruments at a time in an orchestra. I've got a short quote for you. This is what Berlioz had to say about the established practice of writing music behind him. But when I consider the appalling number of miserable platitudes to which the piano has given birth, which would never have seen the light had their authors been limited to pen and paper, I feel grateful to the happy chance that forced me to compose freely and in silence, and this has delivered me from the tyranny of the fingers, so dangerous to thought, and from the fascination which the ordinary sonorities always exercise on a composer to a greater or lesser degree. Many amateurs have pitied me for this deprivation, but that does not bother me very much. So his attitude was, I'm better off for not having learned how to play these instruments.
Well, there you have it. So Berlioz is considered a romantic composer.
Yes, he is the first French romantic, and in fact, the first exponent of what in Europe at the time was called music of the future. And this was important. He became a composer who was studied by later heavy-duty romantics like Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner and the New Russians and Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss, as well as a generation of French composers. Berlioz didn't really have any direct followers because his ideas were too unorthodox for his immediate contemporaries to absorb. But later writers understood, and they carried his influence to every sector, all the way into the musical avant-garde.
Would you remind us what the Romantic period is?
Yes, Romantic composers sought to create music that was individualistic, emotional, dramatic, and often programmatic, meaning the music is meant to be a sort of canvas for a story or some kind of episode that took place, a poem or something along those lines. This music would reflect romanticism that was present in other areas of art, like poetry, sculpture, philosophy. Romantic music was often inspired by or thought to evoke non-musical stimuli such as nature and literature and poetry, supernatural elements and fine arts. It included features such as increased chromaticism, meaning the tonality of the music is starting to get a little more vague, and it moved away from traditional forms that had been used to write symphonies and sonatas up until that point.
You mentioned that Berlioz was a futuristic romantic. What does that mean?
It means that he broke away from the classical rules of harmony and traditional sounds to explore hitherto forbidden chord progressions and a new kind of way of writing a melody, all within this umbrella of romanticism. It was Berlioz who created the modern orchestra as we know it today. And this, in and of itself, this new way of building an orchestra, which included numerous additions and extra people, this demonstrated in and of itself a new kind of tonal power and resonance and color that hadn't been used by composers up until that point. He also was the first person to write music that expressed himself autobiographically, not just an idea that he had, but a story from his life. And that was not something that had been done before Hector Berlioz. It really brought a new dimension, not just to music, but to the psychology of art.
So Symphonie Fantastique itself is quite autobiographical.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of his new technique. This is what led to the symphonic poems which so dominated the last half of the 19th century. This programmatic ideal fused into a symphony, in Berlioz's case, an autobiographical ideal, but other composers saw this, and this led to famous programmatic romantic pieces and modern pieces, things that we know by the names of Till Eulenspiegel, Death and Transfiguration, Don Juan, Les Préludes. All these things were an outgrowth of Berlioz and his style of writing that is presented in Symphonie Fantastique.
Berlioz was quite early as a romantic composer.
That's right. There really weren't any committed romantic composers before him. He preceded Chopin, he preceded Schumann. He was an enthusiast for Romanticism and a revolutionary, but in a conscious way. He was a conscious user of these modern ideas. It wasn't just an idiom that he found himself composing in. He loved the idea of Romanticism, this urge for self-expression and things that sounded or seemed bizarre. This was in direct opposition to the classic ideals of order and restraint that had been present in music up till that time.
Based on his career, I would expect him to have been quite an eccentric person. Is that true?
He really was. He was a young Turk. He was kind of a wild man of music. He was uninhibited. He spent a lot of time making people angry with the things that he wrote and he said. He was highly emotional. He was a witty person. He was very mercurial. He was a very picturesque guy. He was a very unusual type of composer, especially for the early years of Romanticism.
In addition to composing, he was also a writer and a critic, right?
Yes, one reason we know a lot about his ideas is that he wrote so much. He, in fact, wrote an autobiography, and in that, his beloved Romanticism just runs wild, just as it does in his music. This autobiography is magnificently written, even if the fanciful elements in it sometimes outrun the facts in his story. He was a brilliant stylist in writing language as well as composing, and he embraced irony and always used his vivid imagination.
And he did this all on his own as well. He was not trained.
That's right, he had no training as a writer or author or composer. He simply brushed aside all conventions and old ways of doing things. You know, it is said that only a genius could have overcome his lack of basic knowledge about how to write music or how to write language, but only his lack of basic knowledge could have led him down the artistic paths that he took.
Could you give us an example of his writing?
I certainly can. You know, he had been sent to Paris by his father to study medicine, and he hated it. And in fact, he fled from the very first dissection that he attended. Here's what he wrote in his autobiography about attending that dissection. When I entered that fearful human charnel house, littered with fragments of limbs, and saw the ghastly faces and cloven heads, the bloody cesspool in which we stood with its reeking atmosphere, the swarms of sparrows fighting for scraps, and the rats in the corners gnawing bleeding vertebrae, such a feeling of horror possessed me that I leapt out of the window and fled home as though death and all his hideous crew were at my heels. It was 24 hours before I recovered from the shock of this first impression, utterly refusing to hear the words anatomy, dissection, or medicine, and firmly resolved to die rather than enter the career that had been forced upon me. This is the kind of melodramatic, eccentric person that is being revealed, not just through things that he wrote, but it comes out in his music as well.
So I think I know what you're going to say, but how did he do in medical school?
Well, when he was in medical school, he studied a lot of music. He went to the opera constantly. He went to the conservatory library instead of going to the medical library. And he finally dropped out of medical school, overcoming the resistance of his father as well as his mother. She was a very pious woman who thought that becoming a musician was stepping onto the road to hell.
Oh, gosh. Medical school clearly was not the place for him. Was he able to fit in conservatory?
Nope. He shocked everyone when he joined the music school as well. They said things like, he believes in neither God nor Bach. That was written by another composer who felt scandalized by even the presence of Hector Berlioz. He caused a stir even as an audience member when he would go to see performances. In fact, he was attending one performance and he stood up while the orchestra was playing and yelled, "You don't want two flutes there, you brutes. You want two piccolos. Two piccolos, do you hear? Oh, the brutes." And had this very dramatic way of expressing himself, and then sat down to watch the rest of the concert. And this behavior was made even more outrageous by the way he looked. He looked crazy. He had this wild, giant hair that was like an umbrella that sort of swung around, a movable awning over his kind of hawk-like features. He attracted a lot of attention, and he caused a lot of Sturm und Drang wherever he went.
Well, what did his fellow composers think of him?
Well, Mendelssohn, for instance, who was a very reserved person, he found Hector Berlioz to be repellent. He thought that this was all external enthusiasm which was affected or put on, that it wasn't legitimate. But he did still have to admit that Berlioz was a very interesting person, and they were contemporaries, and they did speak to each other, and they did spend time together. Schumann was a little bit more sympathetic. He said Berlioz does not try to be pleasing and elegant. What he hates, he grasps fiercely by the hair. What he loves, he almost crushes in his favor.
Wow, well, clearly history has borne out that he knew what he was doing.
That's right. He was more than some affected braggart. He really did have a very authentic, big vision, and in some ways, even the 21st century has not caught up to the vision of Hector Berlioz.
Give us an example of that vision for symphony orchestra.
Well, one thing to say about his vision for an orchestra was until around the 1830s, an orchestra seldom had more than 60 players on stage. Now, a little bit before that time, in 1825, Berlioz was already writing music involving an orchestra of 150 people, so more than twice as big in terms of the size of the group. He had a dream orchestra that he talked and wrote about, and in fact, he said this was the only orchestra which could properly play the music that he was writing. And listen to this, his dream orchestra had 467 musicians in it, as well as a chorus of 360 people. So out of those players on stage, we're talking about 242 string players, 30 harps, 30 grand pianos, 12 pairs of cymbals, 16 French horns, and an exotic variety of percussion instruments. And all of his friends said this is completely impractical, which is true.
To say the least.
And his enemies called him crazy.
Wow, that is eccentric. So back to the program for this weekend. Symphonie Fantastique was Berlioz's first major work, correct?
That's right. It was his first major work, and it remains his most famous work. It wasn't written at the end of his career. He finished it in 1830 before he left the music conservatory. And this is also the first great piece of programmatic music written by anybody, and that is a piece of music which tells a story.
And what story does this work tell?
Well, the story is an expression of Berlioz's own fantasies and dreams. At the time that he wrote this, he was obsessed with an Irish actress named Harriet Smithson, and this drove him almost out of his mind. He was constantly talking to his friends about her and crying while he described how much he loved her. He was so distraught that she wouldn't communicate with him that he disappeared into the fields and woods around the city. Some people thought that he was going to kill himself on one of these outings, and in fact, one day those concerns became so important that Mendelssohn, Liszt, and Frédéric Chopin all got together and went out on foot to try to find him. He wrote letters to this actress, Harriet Smithson, but these scared her because she thought he was mad and would not even see him. He went to see her in a play, and when she fell into the arms of her love interest in the play, he screamed and ran out of the theater. He caused a huge scene. Well, out of this unrequited love and his frustration at not getting her as his partner came the music for Symphonie Fantastique. He would show her, and he did that and portrayed her in not a very positive light in the final Witches' Sabbath movement of this piece. Later, he changed and made her character in the piece not quite so evil, but still left her in the work. So this piece, it includes his own execution and some other things, but this piece really tells the story of this unrequited love affair.
You mentioned his execution. There's quite a dramatic march to the scaffold in this piece.
That's right, the fourth movement of this piece, which tells the whole story of Berlioz being madly in love with a woman who refuses to even meet with him. It ends up with him being led to his own execution at a scaffold. You can hear this march, and at the end there's a drum roll, and there's even a part of the music where the guillotine blade slides down and his head falls off and tumbles into a basket. So it's graphic, and you can certainly feel that story when you listen to this music. It fits together very perfectly.
So, did this work have any impact on the object of his affections?
Well, I don't know if she was impacted by the work, but she did eventually marry him after 6 years of waiting. He finally was able to secure her. Their relationship was not a happy one. She ended up resorting to alcoholism and having some other problems, and Berlioz took a mistress in some other place. But he was ultimately successful in at least attracting her.
You mentioned another love interest of Berlioz's.
Yeah, that's right. After the fuss that was created by Symphonie Fantastique, he sort of stopped pursuing Harriet Smithson and he moved to Rome. And there he fell in love with another woman, a pianist named Marie Moke. She had married a piano manufacturer, and Berlioz talked about that in his autobiography. And he had a little bit of fun with this episode. I was beside myself with passion and shed tears of rage, but I made up my mind on the spot what to do. My duty was clear. Now, this is after he found out that his new crush had married a manufacturer of pianos. I must at once proceed to Paris and kill 2 guilty women. Marie's mother was the other lady, and 1 innocent man. After that, of course, it would be incumbent upon me to commit suicide. He arranged for a coach, first taking the time to orchestrate an unfinished piece of music, business before pleasure, of course, and then he got himself a dress and some accessories so that he could disguise himself as a lady's maid. This was how he was going to get in and do these murders. He got himself a pair of pistols, a bottle of laudanum, and a bottle of strychnine. Loaded with this conspicuous example of overkill, breathing fire, he gets to Nice and suddenly finds himself cured. And he spends 3 weeks very happy there and accepted all of this with high and good humor. So this is an emotional roller coaster.
Not a well man, it seems.
That's correct.
Oh my goodness. Well, how did his career work out in the end?
Well, he is successful in the end, but he had to fight every inch of the way. People were not enthusiastic about his music. He was often in debt. In fact, at one time in his life, he had to be bailed out by the violin virtuoso Paganini, of all people. Musicians of the older school resisted the innovations of Berlioz or simply ignored them. He did not get very many commissions. He suspected sabotage, in fact, by the musical elite, and he was correct to some degree. Once he went to the premiere of his Requiem, a giant piece, he was standing kind of backstage near the timpani because he thought they might need his oversight as the performance was taking place. There's a part in that piece where the conductor becomes extremely important because there's a rubato. The music slows down drastically, and these are crucial measures for a conductor. Everyone in the orchestra is going to be watching the conductor at that time. And this conductor stopped the music, stopped conducting, and took out a snuff box and inhaled some snuff tobacco. And Berlioz was so outraged by this that he circled around behind the conductor or reached out from the backstage area and tried to conduct those measures himself. This was something that he saw as sabotage of his art, and it's hard to understand why a conductor would do something like that. Because his music was not super popular, he really focused on conducting as well as music criticism to overcome the lack of interest in his own compositions.
Well, he was clearly a man ahead of his time. Did people catch up to him?
Not so much. You know, there's been a revival in Europe since World War II of the music of Hector Berlioz. That revival is not as strong in the United States, but we have heard more of Berlioz's music since 1950 than ever before. His place as a revolutionary, if not unusual composer, is secure by the few works that are performed by orchestras, and his reputation will hopefully grow. That's the spirit that we perform Symphonie Fantastique for our audience this weekend.
Well, it is an exquisite piece of music, and it will be wonderful to hear this orchestra get to play it again.
Sure thing.
Thank you so much for tuning in early. Please enjoy the show.